Part 1. A shot in Sarajevo, Sunday, June 28, 1914. Sarajevo. 10 a.m. The morning was bright and warm, the kind of summer morning that promised a day of celebration. Along the Miljacka River, the streets of Sarajevo were lined with people, men in fezzes, women in their Sunday best, children waving small flags. They had come to see the Archduke. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was not a popular man in this restless province. The empire had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina 6 years earlier, and the memory of that humiliation still burned in the hearts of many. But today, the crowds had been instructed to be cheerful. The Archduke was here to observe military maneuvers, to show the flag, to remind these people who ruled them. At 10 a.m., the motorcade passed the central police station. 6 cars, their roofs folded back, their occupants waving to the crowd. In the third car sat the Archduke and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. She was not supposed to be there. Royal protocol normally forbade her from riding beside her husband in official processions. But this was a military matter, not a state occasion, and Franz Ferdinand had insisted. She deserved this moment. Neither of them knew that they had already driven past one assassin. Nedeljko Kabranovic, a young conspirator, had thrown a bomb at their car earlier that morning. It bounced off the folded roof and exploded under the wheels of the following vehicle, wounding several officers. The Archduke had continued calmly to the town hall, where he delivered his scheduled speech, pausing only to remark, "One comes here and is greeted with bombs." Now, after the reception, they were heading to the hospital to visit the wounded. The driver had not been told of the change in route. When he turned down Franz Joseph Street, following the original plan, the governor riding beside him shouted, "Stop! This is wrong. We must go along the Appel Quay." The driver braked, reversed, and stalled the engine. And in that moment, by the purest accident, the car stopped directly in front of a young man standing outside a delicatessen shop. His name was Gavrilo Princip. He was 19 years old, thin, pale, consumed by the conviction that the liberation of his people required the death of tyrants. He had been waiting on this street, despairing that his moment had passed, when the car stalled inches from him. He stepped forward, drew a pistol, and fired twice. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the neck. The second struck Sophie in the abdomen. As the car lurched forward and sped away, Franz Ferdinand turned to his wife and whispered, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." By the time they reached the governor's residence, both were dead. That afternoon, Sarajevo. The streets. The city erupted. In the hours after the shooting, anti-Serb riots swept through Sarajevo. Shops were looted, houses destroyed, innocent people beaten in the streets. The assassin had been seized. Immediately, his pistol wrestled from his hand, his body nearly lynched by the crowd before police dragged him away. A photographer named Walter Tausch was there. He captured the scene, the arrest of a suspect, dragged through the streets by armed gendarmes while a crowd of onlookers pressed forward. The image would circle the world, misidentified for decades as the arrest of Princip himself. But it did not matter who it was. What mattered was that the heir to the throne was dead, and the world would never be the same. That night, Vienna. The Hofburg Palace. The old emperor, Franz Joseph, received the news in his study. He had lost his brother Maximilian in Mexico, his son Rudolf by suicide, his wife Elizabeth to an assassin's knife. Now he had lost his nephew, the last hope for the succession. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkened city, and spoke only one sentence to the adjutant who had brought the news: "One has not been spared anything in this world." He did not weep. He had no tears left. The telegraph. Across Europe, the telegrams began to fly. Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, London. Heads of state were informed. Foreign ministries went onto alert. The machinery of diplomacy began to turn. No one yet knew that this death would mean war. No one yet knew that the shots fired in Sarajevo would echo across the continent, through 4 years of trenches, through 10 million graves. They only knew that an archduke was dead, and that the world had changed. In a small notebook, somewhere in Vienna, a clerk recorded the event in his careful hand, June 28, 1914. His Imperial Highness, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his consort, the Duchess of Hohenberg, assassinated in Sarajevo. Cause: Serb nationalist conspiracy. It was the first entry in a ledger that would soon fill with millions of names. The war had not yet begun, but the fuse was lit, and the world, unaware, walked toward the flame. Part 2. Vienna. Anger and waiting June 29, 1914. Vienna. The Hofburg Palace. Early morning. The telegram had arrived in the night. Now, in the gray light of dawn, the old emperor sat alone in his study, the paper trembling in his hands. Franz Joseph was 83 years old, and he had seen too much death. His brother Maximilian, shot in Mexico. His son Rudolf, dead by his own hand at Mayerling. His wife Elizabeth, stabbed through the heart by an Italian anarchist. And now his nephew, the heir he had never quite loved, murdered in a provincial capital by a boy with a pistol. He stared at the telegram for a long time, then set it aside. There would be time for grief later. Now there was business to attend to. The empire needed a response. The war party. In the offices of the Ballhausplatz, the Austro-Hungarian foreign ministry, the mood was very different. Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, chief of the general staff, had been waiting for this moment for years. A short, intense man with a brush mustache and eyes that burned with conviction, he had advocated for war with Serbia repeatedly in 1906, 1908, 1909, 1912, 1913. Each time, he had been overruled. Each time, he had seethed with frustration. Now, finally, the excuse had arrived. This must be settled by arms, he told anyone who would listen. Serbia is a thorn in the side of the monarchy. It must be removed once and for all. Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold agreed. Elegant, aristocratic, utterly convinced of the righteousness of the Austrian cause, he began drafting a document that would become the most famous ultimatum in history. It would be harsh, deliberately unacceptable, designed to force a war that Austria-Hungary believed it could win. But not everyone was so eager. The dissenter. In Budapest, Count István Tisza, the Prime Minister of Hungary, read the reports from Vienna with growing alarm. He was a proud Hungarian, fiercely protective of his nation's interests within the dual monarchy, and he feared that a war with Serbia would be a catastrophe. I shall not consent to any military action against Serbia, he wrote to the emperor. We have no proof that the Serbian government was involved in the assassination. To attack without proof would make us appear the aggressors before all of Europe. Tisza was not a pacifist. He was a realist. He knew that Russia would not stand idle while Austria crushed Serbia. He knew that a local war could quickly become a general European conflict. And he knew that Austria-Hungary, with its restive nationalities and creaking administration, might not survive such a war. For 3 weeks, the argument raged. Conrad demanded action. Berchtold drafted documents. Tisza blocked and delayed. And the emperor, old and tired, tried to find a path between them. The investigation. While the politicians argued, the investigators worked. In Sarajevo, the police interrogated the captured assassins. Princip, Kabrinovic, Gribas, they talked freely, proudly, revealing the network that had armed them and smuggled them across the border. The trail led to Belgrade, to Serbian officers, to a secret society called the Black Hand. By mid-July, the evidence was clear. The assassins had been helped by Serbians, possibly with official connivance. But proof of direct government involvement remained elusive. The conspirators had covered their tracks well. In Vienna, the hawks seized on the evidence they had. It was enough, they argued. It had to be enough. The letter. On July 2nd, Franz Joseph wrote to Kaiser Wilhelm II, his German ally. The letter was carefully worded, expressing gratitude for German support and hinting at the need for decisive action. The Kaiser, impulsive and eager to prove his friendship, responded with the famous blank check, an assurance that Germany would stand by Austria-Hungary, whatever it decided. Emboldened, Berchtold pressed ahead. The ultimatum was finalized, its terms brutal. Serbia must suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, dismiss officials named by Vienna, accept Austria, participation in the investigation, and allow Austrian police to operate on Serbian soil. No sovereign nation could accept such demands. On July 23rd, the Austrian ambassador in Belgrade presented the note to the Serbian government. The clock was set, 48 hours to reply or else. The evening of July 23rd, Vienna. The Ballhausplatz. Berchtold stood at the window of his office, looking out over the darkened city. The ultimatum had been delivered. The die was cast. Now they would wait. He thought of Tisha's warnings, of the risks, of the millions who might die. But he pushed the thoughts aside. Serbia was the enemy. Serbia must be punished. The empire must show strength, or it would be seen as weak. Behind him, on his desk, lay a photograph of the Archduke and his wife, taken on that last morning in Sarajevo. They had been smiling, waving to the crowds, unaware that death waited around the corner. Berthold looked at the photograph for a long moment, then turned away. The clock ticked. Europe waited. And in Vienna, the men who had set this in motion prepared for the reply that would change everything. Part 3, Berlin. The blank check, July 5, 1914. Berlin. The Neues Palais, Potsdam. 1 p.m. The summer heat lay heavy over the gardens of the Neues Palais, the Rococo palace where Kaiser Wilhelm II often retreated from the formalities of Berlin. Today, he was hosting a luncheon, and the guest of honor was a man from Vienna, Count Alexander von Hoyos, a 40-year-old diplomat with a carefully trimmed beard and a mission that would change the world. Hoyos had arrived in Berlin that morning, carrying 2 documents. One was a memorandum from the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Ministry, arguing that the time had come to eliminate Serbia as a factor of political power in the Balkans. The other was a personal letter from Emperor Franz Joseph to his German ally, expressing the same sentiments in more diplomatic language. The Kaiser received him warmly. Wilhelm was 55 years old, impulsive, emotional, and deeply shaken by the death of his friend, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The two had met just 2 weeks before the assassination at the Archduke's country estate to discuss the situation in the Balkans. Now Franz Ferdinand was dead, killed by Serb nationalists, and Wilhelm was in no mood for half measures. Over lunch, Hoyos presented his case. Austria-Hungary could not tolerate Serbian provocations any longer. The time had come for decisive action, even if it meant war with Russia. Would Germany stand by its ally? Wilhelm listened, nodded, and then gave his answer. It was, by his standards, remarkably decisive. Germany will support Austria-Hungary faithfully, whatever action it chooses to take against Serbia, he said. Even if Russia intervenes. The words were informal, spoken over coffee and cigars. But they carried the weight of an empire. Historians would later call it the blank check, an unconditional promise of German support that gave Austria-Hungary the confidence to risk a European war. That afternoon, Potsdam, a crown council. The Kaiser, having given his word, moved quickly to secure his government's backing. That afternoon, he summoned a crown council to the palace. Present were Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, a thoughtful, cautious man who would later be vilified as the architect of German aggression, Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, and War Minister Erich von Falkenhayn. The discussion was brief. The Kaiser's decision had been made. The generals and ministers nodded their agreement. Bethmann-Hollweg, who had private doubts about the wisdom of risking a European war, said nothing. The machinery of state was already in motion. That evening, the German ambassador in Vienna received a telegram from Bethmann-Hollweg. It contained the official confirmation of the Kaiser's pledge. The Emperor Francis Joseph may rest assured that His Majesty will faithfully stand by Austria-Hungary, as is required by the obligations of his alliance and of his ancient friendship. Hoyos, who had waited in Berlin for the confirmation, carried the telegram back to Vienna. He arrived on July 6, triumphant. The blank check was signed. Austria-Hungary now had the assurance it needed. The mistake. Why did Germany give such a promise? The reasons were complex. The Kaiser genuinely mourned Franz Ferdinand and was outraged by his murder. The German military believed that war with Russia was inevitable and preferred to fight now, while Germany's army was still superior, rather than wait 2 or 3 years, when Russia's massive modernization program would be complete. There was also a fatal miscalculation. The Germans believed that Russia was not ready for war, that the Tsar would back down, that the conflict could be localized to the Balkans. They underestimated the strength of Russian pan-Slavism, the determination of the French to support their ally, and the speed at which the alliance system could turn a local crisis into a continental war. Most of all, they underestimated the power of the forces they had unleashed. The blank check was written in ink, but it would be paid in blood. July 6, 1914, Vienna. The Ballhaus splits. When Hoyos returned with the German pledge, the mood in Vienna shifted. Tisza, the Hungarian prime minister who had blocked immediate action, was finally persuaded to drop his opposition. Berchtold, the foreign minister, began drafting the ultimatum that would be delivered to Serbia. Conrad, the chief of staff, started planning the mobilization. The war party had won. In the streets of Vienna, life continued as normal. Couples strolled in the Prater. Families sat in outdoor cafes. No one knew that the decision made in Berlin that weekend had set them on a path toward catastrophe. They would know soon enough. The photograph. There is a photograph from that summer, taken somewhere in Germany, that captures the spirit of the moment. It shows the Kaiser and Franz Joseph together, their portraits side by side, the two old allies who had pledged to stand together no matter what. They look confident, resolute, unafraid. They do not look like men who are about to preside over the destruction of their empires. But that is exactly what they are. The blank check has been signed. The war is coming. And no one, not the Kaiser, not the emperor, not the generals or the diplomats or the crowds cheering in the streets, has any idea what they have done. Part 4. The Ultimatum, July 23, 1914. Belgrade. The Ministry of Finance. 6 p.m. The summer heat clung to the city like a fever. On the streets of Belgrade, life continued as it had for centuries, merchants closing their shops, women drawing water from the fountains, children chasing each other through the narrow lanes. No one knew that in a few hours, their world would end. At the Ministry of Finance, the building was nearly empty. Most officials had already left for the day, escaping to the countryside or to the cafes along the Danube where the evening breeze offered some relief from the heat. Only one member of the royal government remained in the capital, Dr. Lazapacu, the finance minister, a 70-year-old man who had seen empires rise and fall and believed he had seen everything. He was about to be proven wrong. At 6 p.m., Baron Vladimir Gisel von Gieslingen, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador, arrived at the ministry. He carried a leather portfolio containing a document that had taken 3 weeks to prepare, drafted by Baron Muselin von Gomirj, a Viennese diplomat known for his precision with language. The document was written in French, the language of diplomacy, but its meaning was brutally clear. Gisel handed the portfolio to Pacu. The note was brief. The Austrian minister requested an audience at 6 p.m. sharp to deliver a communication from his government. Pacu received him, and the document was presented. The ambassador did not stay for pleasantries. He had 48 hours to wait for a reply, and he intended to wait in his embassy, watching the clock. The document. The ultimatum was unlike anything Europe had seen in decades. 10 points, each one designed to strip Serbia of its sovereignty, each one deliberately unacceptable. Serbia must suppress all publications that incite hatred of Austria-Hungary. It must dissolve the nationalist society Narodna Odbrana. It must remove from its schools everything that could nourish anti-Austrian propaganda. It must dismiss from military and civil service any officers named by Vienna. It must accept the collaboration of Austro-Hungarian officials in suppressing subversive movements inside Serbia. It must allow Austrian delegates to participate in the judicial investigation of the Sarajevo conspirators. Point 5 demanded that Austrian officials be allowed to operate on Serbian soil. Point 6 demanded that Austrian investigators participate in Serbian court proceedings. For a sovereign nation, these were not demands. They were a declaration of surrender. The ultimatum concluded with a deadline, 6 p.m. on Saturday, July 25th. 48 hours. No extensions. No negotiations. No appeals. Pacu read the document, his hands trembling. Then he read it again. He was a doctor, a politician, an old man who had spent his life in service to his country. Now he held in his hands the paper that would either save that country or destroy it. That night, Belgrade, the royal palace. Crown Prince Alexander, acting as regent for his ailing father, received the news in his study. He was 25 years old, young for such a burden, but he had been raised for this moment. Around him gathered the prime minister, Nikola Pašic, and the foreign minister, the generals, the advisors. They read the ultimatum together in silence. When they finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Pašic, a veteran of Balkan politics who had negotiated with Turks, with Bulgarians, with Greeks, with every power that had ever threatened his country, spoke the obvious truth. They mean war. But there was still hope. Serbia was not alone. Russia, the great Slavic protector, had promised support. The Tsar, Nicholas II, had sent messages of solidarity. If Serbia could hold out, if Russia would come to its aid, perhaps the ultimatum could be resisted. Pazik drafted a reply that night. It would be conciliatory, accommodating, willing to accept almost everything, but not points 5 and 6. No sovereign nation could accept foreign officials on its soil, foreign judges in its courts. He sent a telegram to St. Petersburg, begging for guidance. Then he waited. July 24, 1914. Europe wakes. The news spread across the continent like wildfire. In Berlin, the newspapers approved of the note. The Zeitung predicted that labor troubles in Russia and political crises in France would deprive Serbia of support. The Tageblatt warned, if any third party attempts to cripple Austria, Germany's power will be thrown in Austria's favor. In St. Petersburg, the reaction was very different. The Novo Vremya, a leading Russian newspaper, published a defiant article. Austria must deal with Russia unless the ultimatum is withdrawn. This is really directed against Russia. In Paris, Georges Clemenceau, the old tiger of French politics, sat in his office at La Homme Libre, drafting an article that would appear on the front page the next day. Never since 1870 has such grave news reached us, he wrote. Never has Europe been so close to a war shock, the extent of which cannot be measured. And in London, the British Foreign Office watched with growing alarm. Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, sent telegrams to Berlin, to Paris, to St. Petersburg, urging restraint. He proposed mediation, conferences, anything to stop the slide toward war. But his messages arrived too late, or were ignored, or both. The machinery had already started. No one could stop it. July 25, 1914, Belgrade, the final hours. The clock ticked towards 6 p.m. In the Serbian capital, the government worked through the night and day, drafting and redrafting its reply. The response was masterful, conciliatory, almost obsequious. Serbia accepted 8 of the 10 points in full. It agreed to suppress publications, dissolve societies, remove officials. On point 5, it offered to accept any cooperation that did not violate international law. On point 6, it agreed to communicate the results of its investigation to Austrian officials, but could not accept foreign participation in its courts. The reply ended with a plea. If Austria was not satisfied, Serbia was ready to submit the dispute to the International Court at The Hague, or to the great powers. It was the response of a nation desperate for peace, willing to sacrifice almost anything to avoid war. At 5:45 p.m., the Serbian Prime Minister himself carried the reply to the Austrian embassy. Baron Gisel received it, read it quickly, and made his judgment. It was not enough. At 6:30 p.m., Gisel and his entire staff boarded a train at the Belgrade station and crossed the border into Austria-Hungary. Diplomatic relations were severed. The next day, July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The telegram. That night, somewhere in Belgrade, a clerk sat in the telegraph office, watching the messages flow across the wires. He saw the declaration of war, the mobilization orders, the frantic appeals from capitals across Europe. He saw the world he had known dissolving into chaos. He did not know that in a few weeks, he would be in uniform. He did not know that in a few years, he might be dead or wounded or one of the millions who would march away and never return. He only knew that the telegrams kept coming, and that each one brought the world closer to the edge. He picked up his pen and made one last entry in the log. July 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Time, 11 a.m. The war had begun. Epilogue. The photograph. There is a photograph from those days, taken in Belgrade, showing the damage inflicted by Austrian shells on houses on Knez Mihalova Street. The image dates from late July or early August 1914, when Austrian monitor boats on the Danube and Sava rivers began bombarding the Serbian capital. A grand mansion, built in the 1870s, has suffered a direct hit. Its facade is torn open, rubble spills into the street, a hole gapes in the wall where once there was a window. The photograph captures the moment when diplomacy ended and war began. The ultimatum had been delivered, the reply rejected, the diplomats withdrawn. Now there was only the sound of shells, and the smoke rising over a city that had tried so hard to avoid this fate. The lamps were going out all over Europe, and no one would see them lit again in their lifetime. Part 5. St. Petersburg. Tsar and His Generals, July 24, 1914. St. Petersburg. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Morning. The telegram from Belgrade arrived at dawn. Sergei Sazonov, Russia's foreign minister, read it in his study, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Austria's ultimatum to Serbia was brutal, deliberately unacceptable. 10 demands that would reduce a sovereign nation to a vassal state. He read the words again, then set the paper down and stared out the window at the Neva River, glittering in the summer light. He was 53 years old, a product of St. Petersburg's elite imperial Alexander Lycee, a man who had served in London, Washington, and the Vatican before rising to become his brother-in-law's foreign minister. He was not a warmonger. He had spent years trying to maintain peace, to balance Russia's ambitions against the realities of European politics. But this was different. He knew what the Austrians intended. They wanted war. And if Serbia fell, Russia's position in the Balkans, built over centuries of diplomacy and sacrifice, would collapse. That afternoon, he called an emergency meeting of the Council of Ministers. The council chamber. 3 p.m. The men gathered around the long table represented the full weight of the Russian Empire. Prime Minister Ivan Goromykin, old and cautious, who had seen ministers come and go and believed that patience was the statesman's greatest virtue. War Minister Vladimir Sukhomlinov, confident, ambitious, convinced that the Russian army was ready for any challenge. Naval Minister Ivan Grigorovich, who knew that his fleet was not ready, that the Baltic was a trap, that Russia's only real naval power lay in the Black Sea. Sazonov spoke first. He laid out the situation calmly, dispassionately, the ultimatum, the deadline, the impossibility of Serbian compliance. He reminded them of the humiliation of 1908, when Austria had annexed Bosnia and Russia had been forced to accept it, powerless to respond. Another humiliation, he argued, would destroy Russian prestige forever. The concessions we have made to Germany and Austria in the past 5 years, he said, have only been taken as signs of Russia's current weakness and cause for greater aggression. Further yielding to the Central Powers in the Balkans is no guarantee of peace. A firm stand risks dangerous consequences, but it is the only way to prevent Russia from becoming a second-rate power. The room fell silent. Goromykin stroked his beard. Sukhomlinov nodded slowly. Grigorovich stared at the table. The decision was unanimous. Russia would support Serbia. The Tsar would be asked to authorize military preparations. July 25, 1914. Peterhof. The Alexander Palace. Evening. Nicholas too received Sazonov in his study, a comfortable room lined with books and family photographs. The Tsar was 46 years old, gentle, devout, deeply in love with his wife and children. He had never wanted to be emperor, had never expected it until his father's sudden death. Now he carried the weight of 160 million people on his shoulders. Sazonov presented the council's recommendations, partial mobilization only, against Austria-Hungary, not against Germany. A warning to Vienna that Russia would not stand idle while Serbia was crushed. Nicholas listened, asked a few questions, then signed the papers. He did not want war, but he could not abandon Serbia. It was a matter of honor, of faith, of Russia's sacred duty to protect its Slavic brothers. That night, he wrote in his diary, a very busy day. Received Sazonov. Decided to begin preparations for mobilization in case of necessity. Walked in the garden with the children. The weather was beautiful. He did not know, could not know, that those preparations would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy his dynasty, his empire, and the world he knew. July 30, 1914. St. Petersburg. The General Staff. 9 a.m. The telephone rang in the office of General Nikolai Yanushkevich, Chief of the General Staff. On the line was Sazonov, his voice urgent. The Tsar had changed his mind. The night before, Nicholas had received a telegram from his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the famous Willy-Nicky correspondence. The Kaiser urged him not to mobilize, to continue negotiations, to let the diplomats work. Nicholas, always hopeful, always seeking peace, had ordered the mobilization halted. But it was too late. The machinery was already moving. The trains were being prepared. The reservists were being called up. The telegrams ordering mobilization had already been sent to the military districts. Yanushkevich explained this to Sazonov. To stop now would create chaos, confusion, an impossible situation. If mobilization was to proceed, it must be general, not just against Austria, but against Germany as well. Sazonov understood. He asked for 1 hour to speak with the Tsar again. That afternoon, Peterhof, the Alexander Palace. Sazonov arrived at the palace, his face pale, his hands trembling. He was shown into the Tsar's study, where Nicholas sat at his desk, looking exhausted. Your Majesty, Sazonov began, I have come to ask you to reinstate the general mobilization. Nicholas stared at him. Think of the responsibility you are advising me to take. Think of the millions of lives that will be lost. Sazonov did not flinch. I have thought of it, Your Majesty. I have thought of little else. But if we do not mobilize now, we will lose everything, our honor, our influence, our security. Germany will dictate terms to us, and we will have no choice but to accept. For a long moment, Nicholas said nothing. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the gardens where his children played. It is a matter of life and death for Russia, he said quietly. You are right. He turned back to the desk and picked up the telephone. The call was short, the words few. I have decided. General mobilization. When he hung up, he looked at Sazonov with tears in his eyes. This is the most terrible day of my life, he said. July 31st, 1914. St. Petersburg. The German Embassy. Midnight. The German ambassador, Count Friedrich von Portalis, arrived at the Russian Foreign Ministry at midnight. He carried a telegram from Berlin. Germany demanded that Russia cease all military preparations within 12 hours. Sazonov received him in his office. Portalis was an old friend, a man who had spent years in Russia, who loved the country and its people. His face was gray with exhaustion and grief. Sergei Dmitrievich, he said, I have to ask you, will you stop the mobilization? Sazonov shook his head. We cannot. It is already underway. To stop now would be impossible. Portalis asked 3 times. 3 times, Sazonov refused. Finally, the ambassador reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. His hands trembled so violently that he could not open it. Will you read it for me? He asked. Sazonov took the paper and read aloud, the German declaration of war. When he finished, Portalis leaned against the wall, his face buried in his hands. I never thought I would live to see this day, he whispered. Sazonov said nothing. There was nothing to say. August 1st, 1914. St. Petersburg. The Winter Palace. Evening. The news spread through the city like fire. Germany had declared war. Russia was at war. That evening, a vast crowd gathered before the Winter Palace, filling Palace Square from end to end. They carried icons, portraits of the Tsar, banners proclaiming their loyalty. When Nicholas appeared on the balcony, the crowd erupted in cheers. The Tsar spoke briefly, his voice carrying across the square. I solemnly swear that I will never make peace as long as one enemy remains on Russian soil. The crowd knelt and sang, God save the Tsar. It was a moment of unity, of patriotism, of faith in the old Russia. A photographer named Karl Bulla was there, his camera capturing the scene. The Tsar on the balcony, the crowd below, the sea of faces lifted toward him. The image would become famous, a symbol of the war's first days, of the hope and pride that would soon turn to despair. No one in that crowd knew what was coming. No one knew that 4 years later, the Tsar would be dead, his family murdered, his empire destroyed. No one knew that the war they cheered would consume 10 million lives and reshape the world. They only knew that Russia was at war, and that they must fight. That night, somewhere in St. Petersburg, a clerk's diary. In a small apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, a clerk named Alexander sat at his desk, writing in his diary. He was 30 years old, a bureaucrat, a man who had never fired a gun or seen a battlefield. But he knew that soon, he might be called. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if trying to make sense of the day's events. August 1st, 1914. War. The word sounds strange, unreal. We have been at peace for so long. The old men speak of the Turkish War, of the Japanese War, but those were far away, distant, something that happened to others. Now it is our turn. The crowd at the palace was enormous. They cheered the Tsar, sang the anthem, waved flags. I cheered too. We all cheered. But now, sitting here alone, I wonder what we have done. Tomorrow, I will go to the recruiting office. I will do my duty. But I am afraid. I am so afraid. God save Russia. He closed the diary and blew out the candle. Outside, the city was dark, quiet, waiting. The war had begun. Part 6. Telegrams between cousins, July 29, 1914. St. Petersburg. The Alexander Palace. 1 a.m. The lamp on the Tsar's desk burned late into the night. Nicholas sat alone, a sheet of paper before him, his pen moving slowly across the page. He was writing to his cousin, Wilhelm, the German Kaiser. They had known each other since childhood, had called each other Willie and Nicky in the easy familiarity of family. Now, in the gravest moment Europe had known in a generation, he reached out to that bond. I am glad you are back, he wrote. In this serious moment, I appeal to you to help me. An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignation in Russia shared fully by me is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. He paused, the weight of his words settling on him. Then he added the plea that would echo through history. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. The telegram was sent. Nicholas waited. July 29, 1914. Berlin. The Neues Palais, Potsdam. 1:45 a.m. The reply came faster than expected. Wilhelm, too, was awake, too, was watching the clock. His telegram crossed with Nicholas's and the wires, each man writing to the other at almost the same moment. It is with the gravest concern that I hear of the impression which the action of Austria against Serbia is creating in your country, Wilhelm wrote. The unscrupulous agitation that has been going on in Serbia for years has resulted in the outrageous crime to which Archduke Franz Ferdinand fell a victim. He reminded Nicholas of the murder, of the debt that Serbia owed. But he also offered hope. I fully understand how difficult it is for you and your government to face the drift of your public opinion. Therefore, with regard to the hearty and tender friendship which binds us both from long ago with firm ties, I am exerting my utmost influence to induce the Austrians to deal straightly to arrive to a satisfactory understanding with you. He signed it, as he always did, your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin Willie. July 29, 1914. St. Petersburg, 6:30 p.m. That evening, another telegram arrived from Berlin. This one was different. The tone had shifted. Wilhelm, perhaps under pressure from his generals, was less conciliatory. I received your telegram and share your wish that peace should be maintained, he wrote. But as I told you in my first telegram, I cannot consider Austria's action against Serbia an ignoble war. Austria knows by experience that Serbian promises on paper are wholly unreliable. Then came the warning. Of course, military measures on the part of Russia would be looked upon by Austria as a calamity we both wished to avoid and jeopardize my position as mediator, which I readily accepted on your appeal to my friendship and my help. Nicholas read the words, and his heart sank. The gap between them was widening. July 29, 1914. St. Petersburg. 8:20 p.m. The Tsar wrote again, desperately seeking a way out. He made a proposal that, had it been accepted, might have changed everything. Thanks for your telegram, conciliatory and friendly, he began. Whereas official message presented today by your ambassador to my minister was conveyed in a very different tone. Beg you to explain this divergency. It would be right to give over the Austro-Serbian problem to the Hague Conference. The Hague, the International Court. A peaceful resolution submitted to the judgment of the world. Trust in your wisdom and friendship, Nicholas concluded. He waited. The hours passed. No reply came. Wilhelm never addressed the proposal for the Hague. The silence was answer enough. July 30th, 1914, Berlin. 1:20 a.m. Wilhelm's next telegram was blunt. The machinery of mobilization was moving, and he could not stop it. It is quite out of the question that my ambassador's language could have been in contradiction with the tenor of my telegram, he insisted. Count Portales was instructed to draw the attention of your government to the danger and grave consequences involved by a mobilization. I said the same in my telegram to you. He pointed out that Austria had mobilized only against Serbia, only a part of its army. But if Russia mobilized against Austria, his role as mediator would be ruined. The whole weight of the decision lies solely on you, our shoulders now, who have to bear the responsibility for peace or war. Nicholas, reading this, must have felt the ground shifting beneath him. The responsibility, the weight, the impossible choice, all his. July 31st, 1914. Berlin. Morning. The final exchange was the most painful. Wilhelm wrote, "On your appeal to my friendship and your call for assistance began to mediate between your and the Austro-Hungarian government. While this action was proceeding, your troops were mobilized against Austro-Hungary, my ally. Thereby, as I have already pointed out to you, my mediation has been made almost illusory." He continued, "I now receive authentic news of serious preparations for war on my eastern frontier. Responsibility for the safety of my empire forces preventive measures of defense upon me. In my endeavors to maintain the peace of the world, one have gone to the utmost limit possible. The responsibility for the disaster which is now threatening the whole civilized world will not be laid at my door." Nicholas replied immediately, his words almost pleading, "I thank you heartily for your mediation, which begins to give one hope that all may yet end peacefully. It is technically impossible to stop our military preparations, which were obligatory owing to Austria's mobilization. We are far from wishing war. As long as the negotiations with Austria on Serbia's account are taking place, my troops shall not make any provocative action. I give you my solemn word for this. I put all my trust in God's mercy and hope in your successful mediation in Vienna for the welfare of our countries and for the peace of Europe." It was too late. August 1st, 1914. The last telegram. Nicholas wrote one final time, "Understand you are obliged to mobilize, but wish to have the same guarantee from you as I gave you, that these measures do not mean war and that we shall continue negotiating for the benefit of our countries and universal peace deal to all our hearts." Wilhelm's answer was cold, official, final. "I yesterday pointed out to your government the way by which alone war may be avoided. Although I requested an answer for noon today, no telegram from my ambassador conveying an answer from your government has reached me as yet. I therefore have been obliged to mobilize my army. Immediate, affirmative, clear, and unmistakable answer from your government is the only way to avoid endless misery. Until I have received this answer, alas, I am unable to discuss the subject of your telegram. As a matter of fact, I must request you to immediately order your troops on no account to commit the slightest act of trespassing over our frontiers." That same day, Germany declared war on Russia. The cousins were no longer cousins. They were enemies. Epilogue. The unanswered question. Why did Wilhelm ignore Nicholas's proposal to submit the crisis to The Hague? Historians still debate it. Some say the German Foreign Office deliberately suppressed the telegram, finding it too unimportant to publish. Others believe Wilhelm, under pressure from his generals, had already decided on war. The French ambassador in St. Petersburg, Maurice Palaiolog, wrote in his memoirs that the proposal was very important, a genuine chance for peace that was allowed to slip away. James the 1000th Beck, an American legal scholar, later accused Wilhelm of abandoning the opportunity for a peaceful resolution. But the telegrams themselves survive. They are preserved in archives, published in books, studied by historians. They are the record of two men, cousins, emperors, who tried to stop the war and failed. In the Churchill Archive Center at Cambridge, the cuttings from the Morning Post containing the correspondence rest in acid-free folders, available to researchers. In the Hathi Trust Digital Library, a catalog of an exhibition at the Museum for Communication in Frankfurt shows the original letters, with their faded ink and royal seals. And on the website of the Canadian government, the full text of every telegram is preserved, a monument to what might have been. They called each other Willie and Nicky. They shared a grandmother. In Queen Victoria. They had spent summers together as children. And in the last days of July 1914, they tried desperately to save the peace. They failed. The war came. And the world they knew was swept away forever. Part 7. Mobilization, July 30th, 1914. Berlin. The General Staff. 11 a.m. The maps covered every wall, Spread across every table, their surfaces marked with colored lines and arrows that told a story of their own. Hundreds of trains, thousands of tracks, millions of men. All of it reduced to ink and paper, to timetables and schedules, to the cold mathematics of war. General Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff, stood at the center of this cartographic universe, studying the latest reports from the East. He was 56 years old, the nephew of the great Moltke who had defeated Austria and France a generation ago. But he was not his uncle. He was thoughtful, introspective, prone to doubts. In quieter moments, he had confessed to friends that he did not know how to fight a modern European war. Now, he had no choice. The reports were clear. Russia had ordered general mobilization. Not partial, not precautionary, full mobilization, the entire army, millions of men called to the colors. And once the Russians mobilized, they could not be stopped. Moltke turned to his adjutant. We have no choice. We must mobilize too. The timetable. For years, the German General Staff had worked on a single problem: how to fight a war on two fronts. To the west, France. To the east, Russia. Defeat one, then turn on the other. But which first? The answer had been given long ago by Alfred von Schlieffen, Moltke's predecessor. Attack France first, through Belgium, sweeping around Paris, crushing the French army in 6 weeks. Then, by rail, transfer the entire German army east to meet the Russians, who would be slow to mobilize, slow to advance, slow to fight. The plan was brilliant and rigid. It depended on speed, on precision, on every train running on time. If mobilization was delayed by a single day, the entire schedule collapsed. If the Russians mobilized faster than expected, the plan failed. And now Moltke had just learned that the Russians were mobilizing faster than expected. He had to act immediately. The Chancellor's dilemma. Across Berlin, in the Reich Chancellery, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg sat at his desk, staring at a telegram. He was the man who had given Austria the blank check, who had promised German support, who had hoped that the crisis could be localized to the Balkans. Now he faced the consequences. Moltke had been pressing him for days. Mobilize, declare war, strike before it was too late. But Bethmann hesitated. He was not a soldier. He was a politician, a diplomat, a man who still believed that peace might be possible. That afternoon, Moltke came to see him. The general was pale, agitated, his voice trembling. We have no time to lose, he said. The Russians are mobilizing. The French will follow. If we delay, we lose our only advantage. We must declare war on Russia and France immediately. Bethmann asked about negotiations, about mediation, about the telegrams still passing between the Kaiser and the Tsar. Moltke shook his head. Negotiations are useless. The mobilization cannot be stopped. The trains are already running. July 31st, 1914, Berlin. The Kaiser's palace. Noon. Kaiser Wilhelm II received the news in his study. He had spent the night reading telegrams from his cousin Nicky, the Tsar, each one more desperate than the last. He had proposed mediation, had offered to restrain Austria, had tried to find a way out. Now it was too late. The German ultimatum was drafted. Russia must cease all military preparations within 12 hours. If not, Germany would consider itself in a state of war. The Kaiser signed it without looking up. That evening, St. Petersburg, the Foreign Ministry. Count Friedrich von Portales, the German ambassador, arrived at the ministry at midnight. He carried the ultimatum in his hand, a single sheet of paper that would decide the fate of millions. Sergei Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, received him in his office. They had known each other for years, had dined together, had trusted each other. Now they stood on opposite sides of an abyss. Portales asked the question 3 times. Would Russia stop its mobilization? 3 times, Sazonov refused. The ambassador reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. His hands trembled so violently that he could not open it. Will you read it for me? He whispered. Sazonov took the paper and read aloud, the German declaration of war. When he finished, Portales leaned against the wall, his face buried in his hands. I never thought I would live to see this day, he said. Sazonov said nothing. There was nothing to say. August 1st, 1914. Berlin. The Opera Square. 5 p.m. The crowd gathered before the palace, thousands of Berliners waving flags, singing patriotic songs, cheering for the war they believed would be short, glorious, victorious. When the Kaiser appeared on the balcony, the roar was deafening. He spoke briefly, his voice carrying across the square. "If our neighbors do not grant us peace, I hope that German swords will win it for us." The crowd erupted. Young men rushed to enlist. Women threw flowers at passing soldiers. The newspapers printed extras, their headlines screaming, "WAR! WAR! WAR!" In the midst of the celebration, a photographer captured the scene, the sea of faces, the flags, the ecstasy of a nation marching toward disaster. No one in that crowd knew that 4 years later, 2 million of their sons and brothers would be dead. They only knew that the war had begun. The station masters. Across Europe, the trains were running. In Germany, in Russia, in Austria, in France, the schedules that had been prepared for years were now being executed. Reservists reported to their depots. Horses were requisitioned. Supplies were loaded. The great machinery of war, designed by generals and refined by decades of planning, was finally in motion. The station masters, the men who actually controlled the switches and signals, became the most important people in Europe. They did not make policy. They did not negotiate treaties. They simply followed the timetables. And the timetables could not be stopped. Once the trains began to roll, there was no turning back. The first would carry reservists to the front. The next would carry ammunition. Then food. Then more men. The schedule was so tight, so precise, that any delay would cause chaos. If a train was late, the men would not arrive. If the men did not arrive, the army would not be ready. If the army was not ready, the war would be lost. So the trains ran. And the world, helpless, watched them go. The Schlieffen Plan in motion. On August 2nd, German troops crossed into Luxembourg. It was a small country, neutral, defenseless. No one fired a shot. But the violation of neutrality sent a signal. Germany was committed. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The same day, troops began crossing the Belgian border. Belgium, too, was neutral, its neutrality guaranteed by treaty, a treaty that Britain had signed. The German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, called the treaty a scrap of paper. The words would haunt him for the rest of his life. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The chain reaction was complete. Within 7 days, a local conflict between Austria and Serbia had become a world war. The last word. A.J.P. Taylor, the great British historian, would later call it war by timetable. The generals had planned for years, drawing up schedules for mobilization, for deployment, for attack. They had built a machine so complex, so delicate, that once started, it could not be stopped. The politicians, the diplomats, the emperors, they had started the machine, thinking they could control it. They were wrong. When the trains began to roll, they rolled all the way to the Marne, to Verdun, to the Somme. They rolled through 4 years of slaughter, through 10 million dead, through the collapse of empires and the birth of new nations. And it all began with a timetable that could not be changed, a timetable that could not be stopped, a timetable that became a death warrant for a generation. Part 8, Teach E. Last Chance, August 1st, 1914, Berlin. The Reich Chancellery. 3 p.m. The telegram arrived at the moment when hope had already been abandoned. For 2 days, the machinery of mobilization had been running, trains carrying soldiers toward the frontiers, officers shouting orders, men kissing their wives goodbye at railway stations. Germany had given Russia 12 hours to stop its mobilization. Russia had not replied. War was coming. Then the telegram arrived. It was from Lichnowsky, the German ambassador in London. He had been in frantic communication with the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, who had spent the last week trying to find a way out. Now, Lichnowsky reported a breakthrough. Grey had offered a proposal. If Germany would refrain from attacking France, Britain would guarantee French neutrality. It was a last, desperate attempt to stop the spread of war. Kaiser Wilhelm read the telegram, and his face lit with hope. Here it was, a way out. If France stayed neutral, Germany could concentrate on Russia alone. The nightmare of a two-front war would vanish. The Schlieffen Plan, with its inevitable violation of Belgian neutrality, could be abandoned. Then we simply marched the whole of our army to the east. Wilhelm exclaimed. He scribbled a note to Moltke, the chief of staff. Now we can go to war against Russia only. We simply marched the whole of our army to the east. That afternoon, Berlin. The general staff. Moltke received the Kaiser's note with disbelief. March east? Abandon the Schlieffen plan? The plan that had been refined for decades, that depended on precise timetables, that had already set millions of men in motion? It was impossible. He sat down and wrote a reply, choosing his words carefully. Your Majesty, it cannot be done. The deployment of millions cannot be improvised. It was prepared over many years, and once the plan has been set in motion, it cannot be changed. If your Majesty insists on leading the whole army to the east, you will not have an army ready to strike, but a disorderly mob of armed men without supplies. He added a warning. The French would not honor their promise of neutrality. They would wait until Germany was committed in the east, then strike from behind. It was a trap. The Kaiser read Moltke's reply, and his hope crumbled. He was not a soldier, not a strategist. He was an emperor who had given his generals free rein, and now he could not stop them. He sent one final telegram to his ambassador in London. The German mobilization would continue. The last chance was gone. August 1st, 1914, Paris. The Quai d'Orsay. 4:30 p.m. In the French Foreign Ministry, the mood was tense. For days, the government had watched the crisis unfold, powerless to intervene. France was bound by its alliance with Russia, but no one wanted war. Not really. President Raymond Poincaré and Prime Minister René Viviani had returned from their state visit to Russia only days before. They had been at sea when the crisis broke, cut off from communications, unable to influence events. Now they were back, and the news was grim. That afternoon, the German ambassador, Baron von Schoen, arrived at the ministry. He carried a document that would become infamous, the German Ultimatum to France. Germany demanded that France remain neutral in the coming war. As proof of its neutrality, France must hand over the fortresses of Toul and Verdun as a pledge, to be returned after the war. The French government had 1 hour to reply. Premier Viviani, exhausted and overwhelmed, turned to his colleagues. What do we do? The answer was simple: refuse. France would not surrender its fortresses. France would not betray its ally. France would fight. At 5 p.m., the reply was delivered. France would act in accordance with its interests. At 6:45 p.m., German troops crossed the French frontier in several places. The war on the Western Front had begun. August 2, 1914. Brussels. The Royal Palace. 8 p.m. King Albert I of Belgium was 39 years old, a soldier king who had prepared his small army for the possibility of invasion. Now that possibility was reality. That evening, the German ambassador presented him with an ultimatum: allow German troops free passage through Belgian territory or face the consequences. The note cited military necessity, the threat of a French attack, the need to preserve German honor. Albert read it, then looked up. Belgium was neutral. Its neutrality had been guaranteed by the great powers, including Germany, in a treaty signed in 1839. To violate that neutrality was to violate international law, to betray a solemn promise. He gave his answer without hesitation: Belgium is a nation, not a road. The ambassador departed. Albert summoned his ministers and his generals. The army would resist. The fortresses of Liege and Namur would hold as long as possible. And if Germany wanted to reach France, it would have to go through Belgium first. That night, the king wrote in his diary, "We are defending our country. God will judge." August 3, 1914, London. The House of Commons. 3 p.m. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, stood at the dispatch box, facing a packed chamber. He was a quiet man, not given to grand speeches, but what he said that afternoon would echo through history. He told the House of the crisis, of the violation of Belgian neutrality, of the threat to the balance of Europe. He spoke of Britain's obligations, its honor, its interests. And he ended with words that would never be forgotten: the lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. The House was silent. Then the members filed out into the summer evening, knowing that by morning, Britain would be at war. August 4, 1914, London. The Foreign Office. 11 p.m. The British ultimatum to Germany expired at 11 p.m. Berlin time. Germany had been given until then to withdraw its troops from Belgian territory. No reply had been received. At 11 o'clock, the Admiralty sent a one-word telegram to the fleet: commence hostilities against Germany. At the same moment, in Berlin, the British ambassador, Sir Edward Goschen, requested his passports. He found the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, pacing in his office, distraught. Just for a word, neutrality, a word which in wartime is so often disregarded, just for a scrap of paper, Great Britain is going to make war on a kindred nation, Bethmann cried. Goschen later wrote, I shall never forget the scene, the Chancellor pacing up and down the room like a caged lion, pouring out his soul in bitter recriminations. The scrap of paper was the treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. To the Germans, it was a technicality. To the British, it was a matter of honor. August 4, 1914. Across Europe, midnight. The clock struck 12 and the war became general. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, Britain, all were now committed. Within weeks, Japan would join the Allies. Within months, the Ottoman Empire would join the Central Powers. Within years, the United States would cross the Atlantic to fight in the trenches. But on that night, no one knew what was coming. They only knew that the last chance had passed. The diplomats had failed. The generals had won. And Europe, proud and confident, marched toward the abyss. In a small village in France, a farmer named Jean sat at his kitchen table, writing a letter to his son, who had been called to the colors. He wrote of the harvest, of the weather, of the hope that the war would be short. He wrote that he was proud. He did not know that his son would die at Verdun, that his farm would be destroyed, that his country would lose 1.5 million men. He only knew that the war had begun, and that he must do his duty. Across Europe, millions of men were thinking the same thing: duty, honor, country. The words that would bury a generation. Part 9. The Invasion of Belgium, August 4, 1914. The Belgian frontier. 8 a.m. The first German soldiers crossed the border near the town of Gemmenich, a quiet farming village that had not seen war in a century. They came in field gray, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythm, their rifles slung, their faces young and confident. Behind them came the horses, the wagons, the artillery, the long gray tide that would sweep across Belgium and into history. The orders were simple: reach France as quickly as possible. The Schlieffen plan depended on speed, on overwhelming force, on the Belgians folding without a fight. The German High Command expected no serious resistance. After all, what could this tiny country do against the might of the German Empire? They were about to find out. August 5, 1914. Liege. The forts. Dawn. The city of Liege was ringed by 12 forts, massive concrete structures built into the hillsides, their guns commanding the valleys and roads that led into Germany. They had been constructed in the 1880s, designed to withstand the artillery of that era. No one had imagined what would come against them now. General Gerard Lemon, the Belgian commander, had prepared his men as best he could. He was 63 years old, a veteran of no wars, a teacher of tactics who had never commanded troops in battle. Now he commanded 40,000 men against an army 10 times that size. On the night of August 5th, the Germans launched their first assault. They came in waves, expecting the Belgians to break. The Belgians did not break. From the forts, the heavy guns opened fire, tearing holes in the German ranks. Machine guns swept the approaches. By dawn, thousands of German soldiers lay dead in the fields below the forts. The German commander, General von Emmich, wrote to Lemon, demanding surrender. Lemon's reply was brief: the troops under my command will defend the fortresses of Liege to the end. August 6, 1914. The city of Liege. Night. The Germans tried a new tactic. Under cover of darkness, a stormtroop detachment led by Erich Ludendorff, a little-known staff officer, slipped between the forts and entered the city itself. They reached the citadel, overwhelmed the garrison, and raised the German flag over Liege. But the forts still held. The guns still fired. And as long as the forts held, the German advance could not proceed. The railroad lines, essential for supplying the invasion, remained under Belgian guns. For 10 more days, the forts held out. August 12, 1914. The Siege of Liege. The Big Berthas. The Germans brought up their heaviest weapons. Krupp's 420mm howitzers, nicknamed Big Bertha after the family that made them, were monstrous machines that fired shells weighing nearly a ton. They had been designed specifically to destroy fortifications like those at Liege. They were hauled into position by steam tractors, their crews working frantically to prepare them for action. The first shell landed near Fort Pontis. The explosion was unlike anything the defenders had ever seen. Concrete shattered. Steel twisted. Men died without warning, buried in their own bunkers. One by one, the forts fell. Fort Barkin, Fort Evny, Fort Flaren. The defenders fought to the last, but against the Big Berthas, they had no chance. On August 16th, the final fort surrendered. The last fort. General Lemon had made his headquarters at Fort Lonson, the largest of the Liege fortifications. On August 15th, a German shell struck the fort's magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire fort collapsed, burying hundreds of men in the rubble. When German soldiers entered the ruins, they found Lemon unconscious, wounded, pinned beneath a beam. They carried him out, and when he woke, he found himself facing General von Emmich. "I was unconscious," Lemon said. "I ask you to witness that I was not captured conscious." Von Emmich shook his head. "General, you have defended your honor. You have defended it magnificently." Lemon spent the rest of the war as a German prisoner. He returned home in 1918 to a hero's welcome. The atrocities. As the German army advanced, something else spread through the villages and towns of Belgium: fear. The Germans, expecting resistance, saw snipers and Franks tirers everywhere. They responded with brutality. In the village of Dinant, on August 23rd, German troops executed 674 civilians, men, women, and children, in retaliation for alleged partisan attacks. In Leuven, on August 25th, they burned much of the city, including the university library with its priceless collection of medieval manuscripts. 300 civilians died. The rest were deported to Germany. The story spread across the Atlantic, amplified by British propaganda. The Germans became Huns, barbarians who murdered innocent civilians and destroyed ancient treasures. The propaganda poster to arms, Britons, showed a brutish German soldier trampling Belgian women and children underfoot. It was crude, exaggerated, and effective. Thousands of British men rushed to enlist. The Germans, for their part, tried to counter the stories. They distributed postcards showing their soldiers distributing bread to hungry Belgian civilians, with captions mocking the barbarian propaganda. But the damage was done. The reputation of the German army was forever stained. The road to France. By August 20th, the German First Army had reached Brussels. The Belgian government fled to Antwerp, taking the army with them. The capital fell without a fight. But the delay had cost the Germans precious time. The Schlieffen Plan, so carefully calculated, had already fallen behind schedule. The Belgian resistance at Liege had bought the French and British critical days they used to move their armies into position. In the German high command, the first doubts began to surface. But there was no turning back. The army pressed on, toward the French frontier, toward the Marne, toward 4 years of slaughter. The photograph. There is a photograph from September 1914, taken in Ghent. It shows Belgian soldiers and artillery in the placed arms, resting after the retreat from Termond. They look exhausted, their faces drawn, their uniforms dusty. They have been fighting for weeks, falling back before an enemy they cannot stop. But they have not surrendered. They have not given up. Behind them, the medieval buildings of Ghent rise into the autumn sky, untouched, for now. The war has not yet reached this city, but it will. In another photograph, taken the same month, German troops marched through the grounds of Elowick Castle, near Antwerp. Their faces are young, their steps confident. They have conquered Belgium in less than 6 weeks. They believe they have won. They do not know that the war is just beginning. They do not know that 4 years from now, most of them will be dead. They only know that they are marching, and that France lies ahead, and that victory is within reach. It is not. But they will learn that soon enough. Part 10, THE World WE lost August 4, 1914, London. The Foreign Office. 11 p.m. The lamps were going out all over Europe. Sir Edward Grey had spoken the words hours before, standing at the window of his office, watching the last light fade over St. James Park. Now, in the darkness, the meaning of those words began to sink in. The lamps were going out. They would not be lit again in his lifetime. In the streets outside, crowds cheered the declaration of war. Young men lined up at recruiting offices, eager to fight before the war ended, as everyone believed it would by Christmas. They waved flags, sang patriotic songs, kissed their sweethearts goodbye. They did not know that half of them would never come home. The world that died. What died in August 1914 was not just peace. It was a world. A world where a British gentleman could travel from London to Constantinople without a passport. Where a German professor could lecture at the Sorbonne and be welcomed as a colleague. Where socialists from every country gathered at congresses and spoke of international brotherhood. Where empires seemed eternal, monarchs secure, progress inevitable. That world vanished in the smoke of 1,000 guns. In St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace stood silent, its ballrooms empty. The court balls, the glittering uniforms, the waltzes, all gone. Within 3 years, the Tsar would be overthrown, his family murdered, his empire dissolved into civil war. In Vienna, the cafes where intellectuals had debated philosophy and art now filled with wounded soldiers, their empty sleeves pinned to their coats, their eyes staring at nothing. The Habsburg Empire, which had ruled Central Europe for 6 centuries, would not survive the war. In Berlin, the Kaiser who had promised his soldiers they would be home before the leaves fell would soon flee into exile, his throne abandoned, his country reduced to ruins. In Paris, the lights of the Belle Epoque flickered and died. The city of cabarets and impressionism of Proust and Debussy became a city of hospitals and cemeteries, its young men buried in the mud of Verdun. The men who marched. They marched away in their millions, those young men of 1914. They marched in London and Berlin, in Paris and Vienna, in St. Petersburg and Brussels. They marched to the railway stations, to the trains, to the frontiers. They marched singing patriotic songs, waving flags, believing in glory. They did not know that they were marching into the slaughter of the Somme, the hell of Verdun, the frozen horror of the Eastern Front. They did not know that they would spend 4 years in trenches, knee-deep in mud and blood, watching their friends die beside them. They did not know that millions of them would never march home. A photograph from 1914 shows a group of German soldiers at a railway station, their faces young and hopeful, their uniforms crisp, their smiles genuine. They are waving to the camera, to their families, to the world they are leaving behind. Another photograph, taken 4 years later, shows the same station, but the soldiers are not smiling. They are limping home, wounded, hollow-eyed, survivors of a war that killed a generation. The legacy. The war that began in August 1914 did not end in December, as everyone expected. It dragged on for 4 years, through 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918. It killed 10 million soldiers and 6 million civilians. It destroyed empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman. It redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. It created new nations and sowed the seeds of future wars. And it changed everything. Before the war, Europe had believed in progress. After the war, it believed in nothing. Before the war, young men dreamed of glory. After the war, they dreamed only of survival. Before the war, the future seemed bright. After the war, it seemed dark and uncertain. The lamps went out in 1914. They never came back on. The last word. In 1922, 8 years after the war began, a British journalist named Philip Gibbs visited the battlefields of France. He walked through the ruined villages, the cratered fields, the forests where not a single tree remained standing. He visited the cemeteries, row after row of white crosses stretching to the horizon. He wrote of what he saw. Nothing is the same. The world we knew before the war is dead. It will not come back. We are living in a new world, a harder world, a world where nothing can be taken for granted. He was right. The world before 1914 was gone forever. The optimism, the faith in progress, the belief that Europe had outgrown war, all of it had been destroyed in the trenches. What remained was a continent in ruins, a generation in mourning, and the bitter knowledge that the war to end all wars had done nothing of the sort. In 1939, 21 years later, it happened again. The photograph. There is one last photograph. It was taken in 1914, somewhere in the French countryside, and it shows a group of soldiers, French, German, British, sitting together around a campfire. They are not fighting. They are sharing food, laughing, telling stories. The war has not yet hardened them into enemies. The photograph is dated Christmas 1914. It captures a moment of peace that would never come again. By the next Christmas, most of those men were dead. The world they had known was dead with them. And the lamps, all the lamps, had gone out forever.